So why don't I introduce very quickly today's panelists. Doctors Dawn Marie Wood, Assistant Professor. Why don't you raise hand, Dawn Marie? Assistant Professor of Psychology. Jessica Preece, Associate Professor of Political Science. And Wendy Birmingham, Associate Professor of Psychology. Raise hand. Okay. And then today's moderator is Lindsay Blau, who is from Liberal Arts Advisement and Careers Center. So she's the moderator. Why I chose them? Because all three of them are teaching gender class in each discipline. Hey, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So first, I thought we would get started with this question about social science. So you've learned from Nawako what social science is and the majors that you're in that support social science. But I'm wondering, panelists, and we can go one at a time if you want, what are you doing as a social scientist?
Yeah, so my main thing is I'm interested in families and specifically marriage. And so it's happening between husbands and wives. I'm most interested in what the relationships, so how people feel about their relationships, so husbands and wives, how that impacts their health. So specifically, I look at cardiovascular health and I look at cardiovascular disease risk, and I use blood pressure to do that. So I send people out into the world with a blood pressure monitor and ambulatory blood pressure monitor. And I look and see what your relationships are like. You fill out a little paperwork. And my goal is to see how individuals' relationship with their spouse or their relationship with other people within their families is actually making them healthier or less healthy. So that's my main job that I do.
Line. Okay, so I'm next. So my primary role on campus is actually as a teaching professor. So as an assistant teaching professor, I have a different kind of a focus, right? I teach more classes than my colleagues who are also conducting research, but I am a co-investigator on some studies. So while I mentor students throughout the major, teaching a variety of classes, you know, from introduction to psychological science through some of our upper division core classes, having to do with scientific writing and diversity and gender studies, as was mentioned, as the common thread running amongst us. That's my focus. But also as a co-investigator, I have an opportunity to work with colleagues on and off campus to study the effects, for example, of mindfulness training on minoritized groups who experience something that we refer to as minority stress, right? How might mindfulness help them to cope and navigate and have a better experience here at BYU? So that's an ongoing study that we're engaged in right now. I've also been interested in the effects of psychology of gender courses on things like religiosity and views of gender roles and even perspectives on homosexuality on campus. I have been able to, I mentioned off-campus opportunities. So in the community, you know, reaching out to partner with groups like the Utah Women in Leadership Project. I've been a research associate with them. I've recently moved into a new role as a content editor for that group, and that keeps me in connection with the very latest literature that's being produced having to do with the subject matter in the courses I teach. And then lastly, and this is perhaps one of the most exciting ways that I get to interact with students on campus outside of the classroom, and that's the work that I do to enhance belonging. So I also co-chair the Diversity and Inclusion Committee in the department, and we have a student-led committee, and I work very closely with those students and love them dearly. And you know, just excited about the work in this space. This panel is an example of some of that kind of work of inclusion and being more mindful of diversity and some of what we experience. Those of us that are contributing and may not be in the majority necessarily, and what that's like and how we navigate that and how we can better support each other in that regard. So those are some of the ways that I contribute in the social sciences.
My name is Jessica Preece, and I'm a professor in the political science department. On the teaching side, I teach gender and politics, and have the opportunity to teach that usually about once a year. So, so that's exciting. My research in the past, most of my research has focused on the causes of women's underrepresentation in politics. So why is it that we see so few women in politics, even though they're perfectly happy to show up to vote, for example? And my more recent work tends to focus on the consequences of women's presence or absence in office. And so I have, and more broadly, participation in other kinds of deliberative settings and things like that. So, so I have some projects on men and women as members of Congress. How do they behave similarly and differently? And I have projects with some other colleagues about what happens when we are in groups with each other and we talk and deliberate, and how do men and women interact in those kinds of settings. So I also have side interests in political parties and experimental research methods.
As you can see, you have an incredible group up here that you get to interface with, and there are social scientists in every field and major here. And so my hope is that as you listen to these individuals and some of the things that we talk about, that you will go and ask similar questions to people who could mentor you through as you are seeking to be social scientists as well. I'm so glad that we have this panel, because the next question I feel is maybe some of the reasons why you're here today. But what kind of internal and external obstacles have you faced in becoming a woman social scientist?
I don't think, for me personally, because I started later, I had my kids and then I went back to school. So I don't feel like I had as many external barriers to what I was doing. Mine were mostly internal. Like, can I really do this? Am I really smart enough to be able to do this? And just that feeling always that I can't live up to what I should be doing. And I think we will talk about imposter syndrome, right? So I feel like that's probably been my biggest barrier, or my biggest obstacle has been myself and my belief in myself. So I don't feel like I've had a lot of external barriers, but definitely internally, I just always had to battle with that idea of, often, like, as a woman, I would like to say that isn't a part of what was an obstacle to me, but it absolutely was, to think, as a woman, am I capable of doing these sorts of things? That's kind of the main thing.
Yeah, I think that's so relatable, Wendy. I'm glad you brought that up. It certainly has been part of my experience as well. And when you think, I've had an opportunity to present at different places on campus, different colleges, even on imposter syndrome and managing it, particularly as it impacts women in our experience. But it is also true, and this statistic may surprise you, given that we so often assume that others don't experience imposter beliefs as we do, that 70% of people will experience at least one episode of this phenomenon in their life, right? They might feel those kinds of things that Wendy's talking about. And that's certainly been the case for me as well. So I count that as kind of an internal obstacle, like you did, overcoming that. Another internal obstacle that I was considering was maybe just even determining the appropriate timeline, right? So Dr. Birmingham mentioned coming back, finishing a PhD later after children were raised, and returning to academia. My plan had always been to return to academia, and so determining just how I wanted that story to read, right? As I was envisioning that timeline, navigating raising 4 children and a return to full-time engagement at this university that I love, was always the goal, but the timing needed to be right. And that process involved a lot of, prayerful consideration, and you know, you work as a team. If you have a supportive spouse, that facilitates those kind of internal obstacles as you're feeling the weight of your obligations in terms of family priorities, but then also wanting to balance that with the call. And that's very much how it is for me on this campus. It's just a beautiful thing when a passion and a career come together. And so to return to teaching, I was balancing many different things: the timing, the feelings of, you know, just am I good enough? Do I have what it takes to contribute and have the impact that mentors had on me when I was an undergrad here, and wanting to have that same kind of an influence for good. Maybe I knew imposter syndrome was going to come up. Maybe I'll just share something that I think is interesting. Because recently I heard Sally Helgeson on a podcast. She is one of the authors of this book called How Women Rise. And she was on a podcast talking with Susan Madsen, who's the director of the Utah Women Leadership Project that I mentioned. And she was sharing how it's important to distinguish, to better understand and navigate and kind of manage imposter syndrome, to distinguish between more benign and problematic aspects of this phenomenon. And I thought it was really interesting to consider that benign might involve like humility in a new role. And I certainly felt that, you know, coming back to academia and navigating that in my first year in this current role. And then problematic, that's tied to more maladaptive forms of perfectionism, I should say, and perfectionistic tendencies, right? And so in my view, they're really, when I listened to her describe that, benign versus problematic, I really started to think more deeply about those aspects of imposter syndrome representing two sides of the same coin. So follow me with this logic. I'm thinking maybe if a virtue taken to the extreme can and often does become a vice for us, then maybe humility in a new role, right, could very easily be taken to the cognitive extreme and maybe manifest as really harsh self-criticism, right? And so obviously that would be more maladaptive, that would be problematic. If we miss opportunities, I think, to cultivate a growth mindset, maybe I'm adding on a little bit more to the question on how do we manage that? How do we overcome it? Because this has been my experience and what's worked for me, right? Not what's worked and like I've got this figured out, but like it's a continual process, and I'm having to remind myself of research that I appreciate by Carol Dweck and others from the mid-1980s that suggests that the cultivation of a growth mindset helps us to be able to better navigate. And so the paradox is this, right? We're talking about two sides of the same coin. A virtue taken to an extreme can become a vice. In my view, I think sometimes we see this imposter syndrome as a bit of a paradox, because others may believe in you and applaud your achievements, right? But you don't believe in yourself or really even own your own success, right? So you believe you instead of them. And so navigating this paradox again typically involves just a cultivation of self-compassion. And that allows for more adaptive inclinations to emerge. And by that, I mean like deriving satisfaction from effort-based accomplishments, right? And even learning to tolerate one's own imperfections. And that can be leveraged too, because as Dallin H. Oaks and others have shared, our weaknesses can become strengths. We need to be careful of that. And this is that two sides of the coin thing, right? But that has been a revelation to me. Coming back to engagement in a professional context after a couple of decades away and experiencing pretty intense imposter syndrome in the beginning, and being blessed to study it as a secondary researcher and present those findings in a variety of contexts was a tender mercy, right? Because then as I experience them myself, I have some idea from an evidence-based perspective of how to kind of eradicate those vestiges that kind of hang on of internalized undervaluing. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Wendy. That's a very lengthy response to some of these conflicts that we navigate, both internal and external, but just some thoughts that have been really helpful to me that maybe could apply for you as well.
Thank you. So my experience, I think, is a little bit different. I graduated and went straight to graduate school. So it's kind of a opposite experience that you would have, and sort of an example of there being different pathways that get us to exciting places. But one of the internal barriers that I faced, and for me personally, again, we each have different kinds of challenges, even more than imposter syndrome, was I never expected to even really have a career. That was not on my radar screen. I grew up with a mom who was a fantastic stay-at-home mom, and that is what I assumed I would be doing with my life. And I went to, I did well in school here, and thought, well, okay, I haven't gotten married yet. And so I know grad school is like 5 to 7 years of stalling, right? So I went to graduate school, and again, just sort of thought of it as like a hobby, a thing that I was good at, that I would just kind of do until my real life started. And then, you know, about 1.5 years or so before, maybe 2 years before I was set to graduate, I was like, oh, well, I'm gonna have to get a job now. I should maybe start taking this like a little bit more seriously. But it was a huge mindset shift for me, because the way that I treated my graduate school experience was I did very well. I did all the things that I kind of needed to do to graduate, but I had not really made that mental shift of having this be my career. This is what I was going to be doing. This is going to be how I was supporting myself. And that's a different kind of mindset than this is like a fun thing that I'm just kind of doing as long as it lasts. And so that was I had this sort of placeholder mindset. And I had a hard time taking my interests and goals sort of seriously as a thing that was worthy of intentional effort, rather than just sort of like, oh, well, what's the next thing that one kind of does here? So that was a really big adjustment for me. And it honestly took a couple of years, even at the beginning of my job here, to kind of just really be able to settle in and start investing in my career in a way that was, I think there was a sense of mourning or loss a little bit, because it was not the way that I envisioned my life playing out, right? It wasn't that I was unhappy, it was just an adjustment. So I think that internal barrier that I had to personally overcome was learning to sort of see myself in this role as a career woman, as someone who had a career that was worth investing in, that was worth taking seriously, that I needed to do the sort of extra things that you do when you're trying to be really good at your job, right? And I just did not have a framework to kind of think about that, and didn't even really understand what was going on. Like, why am I not being as successful as I should be? And anyway, so that was an internal thing. I think on the external side, practical challenges, if you're working in a workplace that is predominantly men, there's some practical challenges. They're often related to inexperience or people kind of not thinking through. So like, for example, if the way that everyone in your workplace sort of gets to know each other and becomes friends is through, like, say, fantasy football or something like that. Like, I had to learn how to do fantasy football. Don't you worry. I won. And then the second year, I won undefeated. So we actually haven't played fantasy football since then in the department. So I don't know. Did I ruin it? Maybe. So there's just some things like that. But I have been blessed to have colleagues that I've been able to address some of these things with, and they've been willing to take feedback and make some changes. And so it's become sort of a more inclusive environment where we can all come with our own interests and the sort of access to things like mentorship and camaraderie are more egalitarian than they were. So So those kinds of things can take some time, and it's really, I've always said, I'd rather have colleagues that are, maybe don't know how to do the right thing, but want to do the right thing, than colleagues who think that they're already doing all the right things and are unwilling to take feedback, right? So, so that's, I think, that's been a real virtue of my experience in my department.
Thank you so much. I hope that you're taking some time to write down some questions. I, turned over here saying I need a pen because I have so many questions. We will have some Q&A at the very end. I just want to make sure you're aware. What I really liked about the discussion so far is that you can tell we've all come into this space as social scientists from very different lenses. Some of us may be considered non-traditional, where we took a break from school, came back into academia, some that had to readjust their expectations for their life. And so our hope in talking about this is that it doesn't look one way. And so that's what I'm hoping that you're hearing, and that there are multiple ways and avenues to become a social scientist. And it may not look like a career, and it may not even look like academia, and how you can still use your social science background for really incredible things in your communities and with your families. So thank you so much for sharing that. I had some follow-up questions about in this internal obstacle of, we talked a lot about imposter syndrome. Thank you so much for giving us kind of that integrated approach to understanding imposter syndrome. But I'm curious, like, what kinds of questions did you ask yourself? Did you ask others? How did you evaluate what to do next? Like maybe a practical application to, like, here were my internal struggles. What were some things that you did as you talked and discussed this with family, friends? God, maybe lead us through some things that might be helpful, a practical application to combating maybe some of these internal voices.
First, that's a good question. How do I battle that? You know what? My husband is really good. My husband is such a support system to me. Social support, that's what I study. And he's so good. And so when I come home and say things like, I don't know that I can actually do this, he reminds me, yes, you can do this. So I think one of the best things to do is to find that social support system that will help you get through. That's kind of the main way that I survive that imposter syndrome. And sometimes I look at what other people are doing, and I really do think, I'm not really sure I'm cut out for this. No, let me say that a different way. I totally am cut out for this because I feel like this is what I do, and I do it well. I really like what I do. Just sometimes, you get a little down on yourself, and I need that support system. And I would tell you that the most important thing you will ever have is that support system that can help you when you're feeling bad, or you're feeling worried, or you're not doing. I love, Jessica, that you said about your colleagues. I have the best colleagues, Marie. I just have the best colleagues, and I always feel super supported with what I'm doing. So support system, that would be my answer.
Wonderful, thank you.
That's a big one. So we talk about strategies for managing imposter syndrome. It's never really, I don't even title those presentations overcoming anymore. I've switched it to managing, because as the literature suggests, it's an ongoing process. I outline 9 or 10 in that presentation strategy for doing what we're talking about, and Wendy's touched on a really important one. And that can come from a significant other in an interpersonal relationship, which is what you study, right? The benefits of. It can come from your experience feeling that. I think for me, another aspect to this that is actually does not come from the literature, although we now have graduate students from our own department who are studying the impact of gratitude, but actually comes from the prophet. And I reserve it as the last of the strategies that I discuss in that presentation, the benefits of gratitude. So when doors began to open for me to return to academia a little sooner than I thought, teaching for 6 years in a part-time capacity when my youngest was then 8 and my oldest was starting at BYU. And that invitation was extended to come back and teach part-time. I stepped through that door, right? Crossed that threshold. Required some courage and faith and management, right? Of kind of some some work-life conflict at times, which the literature suggests if we can overcome that kind of it's referred to as a scarcity hypothesis, that we can just feeling the sense of overload, right? How are we going to navigate multiple roles and all these things that contribute, right? So just being careful to centralize in my mind and heart kind of this sense of deep gratitude for the opening of those doors. Made it easier for me to have the faith to cross those thresholds, to just take that next step, which happily in my case led from a 6-year very educative experience as a part-time adjunct instructor to a 7th year as a visiting full-time contributor in the department to beginning just this last fall in a professional track CFS position. I look back across that, starting my 9th year here, when now 3 of the 4 of those children have either graduated from or are currently attending BYU, and that youngest 8-year-old is now 16. I think how grateful I am for the opportunities that have been provided. And so my role in that was to be prepared from an educational standpoint to serve where I was needed. And then to continue to gain the experience to be more effective in that regard and be utilized in different ways. But it all comes back to, like, how do I have the faith and confidence to kind of overcome the intellectual self-doubt associated with just the logistics of doing all these things, right? And it really is true that gratitude has facilitated that. It sounds so churchy and something like, oh, she'd say that if you wait, but it's so true. And I feel just intense gratitude for that. And so I think about, okay, well, what's my part? And my part is that I can exercise just that little bit of faith to put one foot in front of the other, focus on my feet, knowing that the Lord is guiding my path, because I'm trying to stay close to the promptings of which opportunity I should accept and when and how I should structure this, that, and the other thing. And to me, I see more of an opportunity for work-life integration than work-life balance, because you're never really balanced. You're trying to do multiple things at once. Yeah, and so that's been an important part of my journey and how I navigate. And I do say that is kind of the best of last of the 10 that I talk about. And I love that we're now seeing some literature that suggests that gratitude does in fact help us to manage imposter syndrome.
Wonderful.
I would say, so all of us have different, right? And so one of the spiritual gifts that I think I've experienced has just been like a very constant and clear sense that God loves me. I don't know why I get lucked out with that being a thing that has never been a question in my brain. I know that that's not the way everyone experiences that for whatever reason. I just will be grateful. And so for me, there have been periods of time where I've felt like an imposter, but it has not been like the biggest barrier for me. I think because of this, just, for whatever reason, this is kind of the way that my psychology is played out. But when I have had those experiences, what's been very important for me is to have a group of people who I feel like can be very real with me. So not just like a hype team, but like people who if I need to kind of, if I like give it to me real, right? Like, and just tell me nice things, right? Be able to tell me, yeah, okay, here are the things that you need to do better, or no, I really think you can do that. And so there's just sort of certain people in my life that have a lot of credibility, right? And so when they say, you're up for this, then I know that they would tell me if I weren't. So I think that's been really valuable, is having people who you trust, whose opinions and evaluations you really can trust. And then of course, like the most important person on that is God and yourself, right? And really being able to capture a sense, if possible, that God has a lot of confidence in you. And I think that, at least for me, that's been a really, really valuable experience, is that even when I'm failing at something, having a sense that this is a thing I need to do, and therefore I'll be able to figure it out. I don't know how, but we'll figure it out. So also, I guess the other thing that I would say is the first couple of years of the job, as I mentioned, were a big learning experience for me. But one of the things that I learned was the things that I was good at and the things I wasn't good at. And I learned to develop sort of neutral feelings about the fact that there were some things that I was good at and some things that I was not so good at. And instead of always trying to be really good at everything, I started to think, how can I surround myself around people who have talent skills that are different than mine? And therefore I can do a bunch of the things that I'm really good at, and they can do a bunch of the things that they're really good at. And with our powers combined, we can publish the world. So that's been really important for me, is sort of letting go of the need to be good at all of the things or be the best at all of the things, right? And so when I have colleagues that are really good at, doing data cleaning and data analysis, I'm like, great, that kind of detail-oriented stuff is like not my best. And I can acknowledge that, and I can see that about myself. And it doesn't mean I'm not a good person or able to be a good social scientist. It just means that I have to be practical about which things I need other people in my lives to help me with.
Let me just say
Oh,
one
yeah,
more thing on
please,
that. Sorry. The day, honestly, that I felt like was the best day of getting over imposter syndrome, although I still have it a lot, was I had a student in my office and they were asking me questions about how something worked. And I was literally able to walk through the whole thing and say, it works like this and this and this. And I remember that I came home and said to my husband, oh my gosh, I do know what I'm talking about. It was such a great feeling.
No, I'm glad for that anecdote. And I love that we are at a place where we can talk about how faith works, and that the research is starting to show some of these really beautiful principles of the gospel, that there's literature that's coming out that is going to testify to that too. That's so wonderful and great. Thank you so much for that. So kind of switching gears a little bit, I wanted to kind of go into your expertise, because I'd love to know how we take what you're learning and then what we're talking about today and kind of marry these two things together. So based on what you're teaching in your courses, what trends are you seeing in the world? And then how, for our BYU women students, as it relates to being prepared to be a social scientist? So what trends are you seeing? And then kind of looking at BYU women students, and then what that means for social science.
So I think what I'm seeing mostly in my classes is that I'm seeing women in my classes feel more confident. I'm seeing that confidence. So I talk to students about grad school, right? And I sometimes will have students in my class, women who don't think they can make it. And one of my favorite things to do is say, no, you can, like you can do this. And I'm seeing more and more women in my class. So that's the trend I'm seeing. I'm seeing more confidence in women than I used to see. And I think that's probably one of my favorite things, is to see women feeling empowered and feeling like they actually can do it. I do really encourage grad school with all of my students. But that being said, actually, my big advice that I always give is that you're in charge of your own destiny, and that you are allowed to receive your own inspiration and your own revelation for your own life, and that you need to take that ability you have to use your own inspiration, your own revelation, to get to where you want. And that it's important to listen to the Spirit when it's telling you this is where you need to go, instead of listening to maybe all those other things that are happening, those buzzing things that are saying, no, you really can't do it. That's probably one of my most that I push, is you've got to listen to the Spirit so that you know where you're supposed to be. I don't know if that went off track, but
I liked
sort
it.
of.
That's okay.
Kind of like
Thank you
off
so
track.
much.
BYU women students. I love that I'm seeing a greater desire to pursue graduate studies. So many more female students interested now in pursuing a master's or doctoral degree, and I love that. To take that ambition and just put it into the development of like a transition plan from undergraduate student to employed professional, right? And help them navigate that beginning with the end in mind. That's exciting to me. Also kind of a desire to have it all. Love that. Perhaps not all at once. Right? Brother Faust talks about, he was on President Faust when he said it's not requisite for a woman to necessarily sing all the verses of her song at the same time. I love that because, and Elder Oaks has emphasized that timing is what's important, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do things sequentially or that you'll have the opportunity to do all the things that you envision along that path in sequence, right? And the life just doesn't happen that way. And so being prepared for those opportunities when they come by virtue of, you know, this greater interest in graduate studies is thrilling to me. And then just the desire to make that work, however that works for you and or your family. And then I also am inspired in mentoring sessions with students to see just a greater commitment to this work-life enrichment. This is different than like that scarcity hypothesis. This is more of an expansion hypothesis. The expectation, in fact, the hope that being engaged in multiple domains will actually enhance your experience, increase your resources and support, right? And that kind of a mindset with just more female students on campus realizing that that's a thing. And having fulfilling, you know, rewarding professional opportunities can actually produce positive spillover into the home. That's kind of a transformational concept and shift in the paradigm of our contribution. And years ago, when I was a child, President Kimball talked about the importance of women in the church being prepared to step up and into their privilege and what the Lord expects and needs from us in the latter days. And so that's meaningful to see that women want to have a happy home life and benefit from positive spillover effect and know how to get it and are interested in what are the steps, help me navigate this. And then I'll have the confidence to be able to take those steps, feeling grateful for the opportunities that are now mine that wouldn't have been perhaps in my mother's or grandmother's generation. Wow, what an exciting trend that is. Right? I love that.
Thank you.
Most exciting trends that I'm seeing in my classroom are that my students, both male and female, are social scientists. They're doing social science in our classes. And you know, so I'm teaching a capstone course right now, and my students are all coming up with research questions. And we're going to spend the semester helping them answer those research questions as social scientists. So this is not even a like, you know, how would you become a social scientist? Like they're doing it right now. And that's very exciting to me is seeing our students with those kinds of capabilities and asking super interesting questions. So I would say that's the trend that I'm the most excited about. And that's, you know, students, men and women. We're having gone up of women students over the last little bit. So that's exciting. Can I say the trend that I'm a little bit nervous about? Is that okay? So one of the trends that I'm a little bit nervous about, and I think I do see this more with our women students than with our men students, but maybe it just comes in different ways. And that is the desire to make the perfect plan. Right? To try and make sure to make all of your choices exactly right and just get all of the timing right and get all of, you know, and I think there's so many virtues to planning and to trying to make good choices. And those are all really wonderful things, but it is also the case that it's often, we don't have incomplete information, you know, to bring a social science concept in, right? And so I would encourage my students to understand that some advice that my mom gave me, which is make a good choice and then make that the right choice. And so sometimes we don't, we're so caught up in like, what if I do this wrong? And should I do the internship now? Or should I be the RA now? And I don't know, there's like, what if I get it? And I just like, your life is never doomed, right? Always fix these things, even if you turn out, even if you sort of like, well, that was the wrong choice, that's still fixable, totally fixable, right? So that's the trend that makes me a little bit nervous, is like just this sense that I have to get it all right and I have to choose in exactly the right way. And I think, sometimes we don't have all the information we need to make the best choice. And so we just do what we can and it works out.
Yeah, can I add to that? The caveat to this transition plan I'm talking about is that's a rolling 3 to 5 year plan, right? That needs to be revisited again and again. And I always tack on to the end of that advice as we work through and develop those, which happens to be an assignment in one of the introductory courses that I take, is life is always all about how you navigate plan B. That's what you're doing, right? Or C or D or R, right? It's never initially what you envision, but the arc of that trajectory gradually bends where you're supposed to be, and maybe the how it's modified along the way. But again, there's grace there too.
And it's fine to be like, well, turns out that's not the thing that I want to be doing with my life. That's information. That is information, right? And so, it's all learning. Right?
Giving yourself permission to pivot and to ask hard questions and to reevaluate and to ask people around you, and relying on yourself and trusting yourself, that embracing that ambiguity. So I had so many other questions I was going to ask, but this has been so wonderful. I'd like to maybe give a round of applause before we go to the Q&A. I think about, I don't know, 8 minutes for questions, and then we have some refreshments after as well. So if we could, 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll have some time for refreshments. So time is yours. What kind of questions do you have for our panel today? Yes, please.
So for those of you that went back, after you had what I'm doing, because we're free, and I still kind of feel really overwhelmed. What advice would you have given to like your younger self for creating both momentum for yourself, but also, I have all these, I'm here on campus and I'm like, this is where I belong, this is so great. And then I get home and I'm like, yeah, all these people need me for all these different reasons, and their little worlds depend on my availability. And so what wisdom do you have for that?
Yeah. So, my young was 15 when I went back full time. So I just didn't have the commitments at home that other people have. And so, but I did have a husband who traveled, so who lived in a different place. So that made it a little bit more difficult. What would I go back and say to myself? I think be easier on yourself. Quit being so hard. I think that's what I would tell me. Quit being so hard on yourself, because oh my gosh, I am. I just am always finding fault with it. So I think that would be, and say you can't do everything. Okay, you can't do everything. And the more we expect ourselves, then the harder I get on myself. So I had to find the place where this worked and I could put all my energy there at that moment without feeling bad that I wasn't putting my energy there. And even if it meant that the 17-year-old, 16-year-old wasn't really getting my full time, I knew that I could go back and forth without destroying him. I don't know. He seems pretty good. He made it. Yeah. So I think just not being so hard on myself and knowing that I can put things to different places. I don't know that helps.
And grabbing those moments that are going to be fewer, far in between. An example with my 16-year-old just last night. I was where he knew he could find me in my home office working on things for lecture today in classes, and he came in and was home from karate or whatever he now drives himself to, right? And likes to do that on his own, and came home and said, just announced his presence. Now is the time of night when I'm coming to talk to you about random things. And I do push back from my computer, turn toward him and look at him. I've tried the continuing to type while I'm pretending to listen. That doesn't work. He knows. And I know that this is one of those moments. And I don't want to miss it. He's busy and doing many things on his own now, more independently, as you know, we have that same circumstance, but it's a whole different ballgame with younger children. And if that's where you're at, then it gets a little more complex. But prioritizing things, letting some things go. In my house, I'm just gonna say, sometimes laundry doesn't get folded until Saturday. And we run loads every day, so you know how big that pile is. Right?
In my house, the laundry never gets folded.
Oh, okay.
I literally just put it in tubs that have labels, and so like, I just throw it in, and I don't, if it needs to be, you know, like this, I just hang up when it's wet, let it hang dry, but like anything that's knit.
Brilliant.
It's because it turns out no one
Figure it out.
else, it's like fine,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and that's knowing what it is that's really
Right.
like that has to be done.
Yes,
Yeah.
prioritizing.
And relying on your community too, to help where that's something I have young children, right? And when I went back to get my master's, that was something I had to give up a lot and rely on my community and make sure they know that what exactly I needed. Okay, one more question, please. Okay, one more.
Oh, I know this is so much pressure to make it good. So I feel like it's easier to envision the place that you want to be or like your goal when you have like role models to look up to or like people who have done it. And for those of us who maybe want like a family and a career, like there's just less of those role models in the culture in where we're living. And so I guess how, like, do you have any advice for seeking out those role models and like understanding how they did it? Because like some of the things that I feel like are possible, I just don't know how they're possible because I've never seen it happen.
Come and ask us. We want to talk to you. Right? To allow us to mentor you through that. That's one of my favorite things. Yeah, to do. And it may seem like there are not many of us, but there are. And just look around in each of your departments and you'll find us and we know the importance of that kind of modeling and its impact, and we now want to give back in that regard. And so I would just, as often as we can, invite students to our office hours and have them believe that it's not an indication that they're struggling, but that we really just want to help and get to know them. And
I think an important thing you just said is look outside your department. I think you might, sometimes we get like focused in on the person who looks like me or who I want to be. Step outside the department and look at other people. So go to political science, even if you're in psychology, if you can see Jessica right there and you say, okay, I want to talk to her. Be open to looking outside of your department, I think.
Okay, I'm getting some signals that I'm just kidding. We are wrapping up. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Let's have one round of applause.